The wind that prowled the streets of London that March evening smelled of iron, fog, and forgiveness that had taken too long to find its address. Within it rode a black carriage without a crest, its lamps shaded, its wheels respectful of stones that had borne too many secrets. And inside sat the Duke of Ashbourne, returning to a city he had once fled with a scandal for luggage and a ring that had never reached the hand it was made for. 10 years, he had measured them not in months but in absences. In the ledger of his soul, the column marked Arabella Whitmore had never been balanced. Each attempt at forgetfulness had accrued interest until it became ruin. The newspapers had once called him a romantic fool, then a coward, then a ghost. They were right in all 3 languages. Now he had returned not to correct the record, but to finish a sentence he had left unspoken before an altar and a congregation that had come only to enjoy certainty misbehaving. He had expected London to age without him. It had, and it had not. The same fog embroidered its bridges, the same lamps pretended at courage, the same gossip curtsied to new victims. But the streets he remembered in the first person now greeted him in the conditional mood. If, they whispered, you had stayed. He drew the curtain aside and watched the gaslights multiply like apologies along the Strand. His reflection, a face still handsome enough to accuse but not enough to excuse, stared back. The gray in his hair had the decency to look deliberate. The scar on his jaw, souvenir of a duel fought to defend a name already lost, had healed into irony. In his gloved hand, the ring lay cold, heavier than it had been the day he bought it. Emeralds for courage, gold for permanence, both qualities he had mislaid. At Grosvenor Square, the house waited. Servants opened its doors without curiosity. Loyalty in households that survive scandal is merely exhaustion made polite. Inside, the air smelled of furniture that remembered better days. He walked through rooms that had learned silence as an art, the drawing room that had once been meant for laughter, the library that had betrayed no one because it had refused to take sides, the hall where the portrait of his father, a man of empire and schedule, looked down as if forgiveness were a commodity that must be earned in quarterly installments. "Your Grace," murmured Ellis, his oldest servant, and then stopped, because to ask why now would have been treason. "Prepare the blue salon," the Duke said instead, "and have a note delivered to Lady Whitmore." The name tasted like fire and frost in equal measure. Ellis blinked once, the only rebellion permitted, and bowed. "At once, Your Grace." When the door closed, the Duke stood by the hearth and allowed the years to approach him like creditors. He did not sit. Sitting was for men at peace. He had seen her name again in the society pages a month before, Lady Arabella Whitmore, companion to the Dowager Duchess of Penrith, advocate for the education of orphaned girls, never married. The paragraph had been as brief and devastating as a prayer answered too late. 10 years ago he had promised her everything and delivered absence. She had repaid him by living, which is the cruelest form of grace. Now he had returned to ask for what no law could compel and no priest could sanctify. Another chance to be the man she had already forgiven in order to survive. The city beyond the windows muttered its old song of wheels and wagers. Somewhere in Mayfair, carriages queued for a ball where young men still mistook charm for destiny. He imagined her among them, grace in gray silk, hair pinned with the economy of a woman who no longer performs but endures, eyes that had learned how to look at the world without waiting for it to look back. He wondered if she would recognize the sound of his name spoken again, wondered if he would. The thought startled him into a laugh too dry for mirth. "Recognition," he told the empty room, "is the cruelest hospitality." When Ellis returned, he carried not 1 letter, but 2. "From Lady Whitmore, Your Grace." The handwriting, still unhurried, was its own verdict. "The Dowager requests my presence at dinner this Friday. I shall attend. If Your Grace also intends to be present, I will behave as society requires. I shall nod, and you shall bow, and the world will go on pretending it can survive its own manners." Beneath, a postscript. "I hope the years have treated you with the same honesty they afforded me." He read it twice, then folded it carefully, as one does with relics. Honesty. Yes, the years had been honest. They had told him every morning that he had chosen fear over love and pride over truth. They had shown him the cost of self-preservation, loneliness that breeds respectability. They had taught him how easily a man can become his own ghost, and how difficult it is to persuade the living to believe in hauntings. On Friday, he would see her again. Not as the bride he had left, but as the woman who had survived the absence. Outside, the bells of St. James struck 10. He removed his gloves, placed the ring upon the mantel, and studied it. The emerald caught the light and offered back a memory. Her hand, slender and steady, the day he had slipped it onto her finger for measurement. "It's too big," she had said, laughing. "Then it shall fit when you are nervous," he had replied. Foolish prophecy. It had never fit because he had never earned it. Now, 10 years later, it gleamed like a promise rehearsed too often to sound sincere. He poured brandy, drank, and let the heat remind him of blood. In the mirror, the fire painted him in colors of confession. He spoke to the empty air because solitude, after a decade, deserves conversation. "Arabella," he said, testing the syllables for fracture. They held. "You once told me courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else was worth it. I am here to decide." The house, cautious of sentiment, kept its opinion. He lifted the ring again, closed it in his fist, and listened to the faint protest of metal against glove. In that small sound, the next days already began. The carriage to the Penrith mansion, the ballroom thick with violins, the moment when her eyes, amber, level, unastonished, would find him and refuse to look away. He slept little that night. Dawn arrived pale as remorse. When Ellis drew the curtains, the Duke was still by the fire, fully dressed, the ring in his pocket, and a resolve that trembled but did not retreat. London was awake now. Gossip had stretched, yawned, and resumed its industry. Somewhere a paperboy called the news that tomorrow would forget. But for him, tomorrow had already been waiting 10 years. 10 years is time enough for a memory to learn good manners, but not enough to make it stop speaking. When the Duke closed his eyes, the day returned with the immodesty of youth. The bells of St. Martin's rehearsing their happiness, the smell of orange blossom and beeswax in the Whitmore chapel, the silk hiss of ladies arranging themselves into judgment, and at the center of it all, Arabella in ivory, not ethereal. As poets lie about brides, but vividly, beautifully alive, a woman about to begin a life she had chosen with both mind and heart. He had arrived an hour early, because punctuality felt like piety, and walked the small path behind the vestry where the yews made a dark corridor for men who needed to speak with themselves before speaking aloud. In his pocket, the ring, emeralds like quiet fireworks, warmed to his hand. He had rehearsed the lines society required, but his chest beat with less ornamental words. "Thank you, forgive me, believe me." When Ellis touched his sleeve, "Your Grace," and handed him the folded note that would undress the hour of its finery, he did not at first understand. The seal was not waxed with malice. The hand was not a stranger's. It was his mother's. His mother had been dead 6 months. She had died as fastidious ladies do, tidily, leaving lists behind her so that grief would not seem like a disorder. The note he held had been entrusted before her illness grew terminal, with instructions precise enough to outwit time. Delivered to Edward on his wedding morning. He broke the seal with the reverence one extends to relics, and read sentences that walked toward him holding knives wrapped in linen. His father, the old Duke of Ashbourne, architect of empire and bankruptcies of the heart, had left not only debts, those the son had known, but an unpayable deficit of honor. A second family in Naples, a mistress in Paris supplied with jewels that, it turned out, had never been the Duke's to give, and a letter, the last, the worst, sent to his mother by a man in Vienna who claimed that the diamonds chosen for Arabella's parure had been bought with funds stolen from a trust belonging to widows of a regiment Ashbourne had once commanded. The jewels upon his bride's throat, he could see them already in his mind, bright as lies, were purchased not of love, but of theft. His mother did not accuse. She advised, return the jewels, undo what you can of your father's arithmetic. Delay the wedding a fortnight, only that, long enough for restitution that will allow you to present the woman you love to the world without debt festering inside her name. The letter ended without signature. It did not need one. He stood under the yews and looked at Joy until it became interrogation. A fortnight, was that all? He could tell Arabella, she would believe him. And yet the trust, once broken, is shy of even gentle hands. Would the world believe? It would not. The papers that morning sang already of the match. Invitations had made a city of witnesses. A fortnight would become a scandal would become a story, and the story would belong not to truth, but to the mouths that prefer sport. He should have told her. There is an argument for that which no decent man can defeat. But love, his, flawed, terrified, made a poorer choice and called it protection. If he married her with the jewels upon her throat and the wrong beneath them, he would place upon her reputation a debt she had not chosen. If he told her in that hour, the chapel would become a court and their vows a plea. If he delayed by command, as a duke, he would make her bear the insult of a reprieve, whose reason he could not publish without parading his father's dead shame. So he chose the cowardice that imagines itself noble. He decided to disappear in order, he told himself, to repair. He sent Ellis to the Whitmore Chapel with 3 words on a card, "Forgive me, wait," and fled in an unmarked carriage to the solicitor who could begin the labor of returning what was not his. He did not know that Ellis, devoted to efficiency, would hand the card to a sacristan who, confused by its brevity and the abundance of paper that morning, placed it upon a table where ribbons and oaths had already formed a small forest. He did not know that Arabella, kept in the bridal chamber like Hope behind glass, sat with her cousin reading the book of Psalms and would not see his miserable sentence until the city had already minted a better. The Duke has fled. What followed belonged to London, its relish, its speed. A groom, sent to fetch him from the vestry, returned with an empty air. A murmur passed through the pews as if the building had developed lungs. A gentleman who collected gossip as others collect stamps stepped out to the street and dispatched a boy to the papers. The Whitmores, stalwart and desperate, blamed the carriage, then the weather, then the clocks, then no one. Arabella did not weep. She stood, placed the veil upon the chair herself, and said in a voice that rearranged the room into dignity, "We shall not proceed today." Then she curtsied to the women whose compassion would later transform into anecdotes, and walked from the chapel with the carriage her father commanded, a Whitmore crest on the door, and an expression her mother would have called weatherproof. He heard of it only hours later in the barrister's chambers off Lincoln's Inn, where he had been burning the day with signatures and instructions, learning the legal ways to make a dead man answer for the living. The barrister, sincere, efficient, innocent of romance, reported the rumor casually. Then, seeing the Duke's face turn into something that might frighten a courtroom, stammered, "It will settle, Your Grace. Society's appetite is brutal but brief." "Briefness," the Duke said, "is a mercy reserved for the merciless." He signed, instructed, borrowed, pledged, ordered the return of diamonds that had already been catalogued for their sinister sparkle, and dispatched couriers like prayers flung at a shut heaven. It would take weeks to unwind the knots. It would take money that did not yet exist. It would take the one commodity he had least right to demand from the woman he loved: time. That night he wrote to her, pages that apologized, explained, begged, and sealed them with the only courage he had managed: his name. The letter did not arrive. A footman, loyal to the economy of the household, judged a distraught messenger less reliable than a morning post, and laid the packet on a silver salver, where it waited for a schedule that obeyed no heart. By the time it was delivered, 2 days had bloated into eternity. Arabella read it. The coal in the grate remembered to burn in sympathy. She folded the pages once. She did not tear them. She sent one sentence back, not petulant, not melodramatic, merely accurate. "If you mean to repair, do so. If you intend to return, come as a man who has already finished the work." He finished none of it quickly. The trust in Vienna demanded affidavits. The Parisian lady demanded theater. The Neapolitan family demanded truth that the British press would not pay for because it did not sing. He traveled, argued, sold portraits to buy mercy, sat in rooms where men who understood only the arithmetic of profit tried to teach him how to be clever, and learned, instead, how to be honest. His name, pried from one ruin after another, became less of a weapon. Each triumph arrived without trumpets because none of it touched the wound that required healing most, the woman he had asked to wait and left starving on a diet of rumor. When at last he returned to London 6 months later with receipts and restitutions, ready, he believed, to stand in Whitmore House and insult the wallpaper with his apology, he discovered the worst habit of pride. It breeds silence in those it injures. Arabella had gone to the country with her mother. The Whitmores had dismissed callers like bouncers at a grace they did not host. The city, bored, had learned a new scandal. He sent letters that came back with the politeness of refusal. He called and was told that Lady Arabella had no appointments this decade. He waited in squares at hours he knew she once walked and learned how weather can mock a man's schedule. In the end, there is always an end when men grow tired of being thrown from the same horse. He ceased knocking at a door that would not open and chose a path that looked like exile but was only penance. He left England to wrestle the last of his father's ghosts abroad, promising himself he would not return until he could place the ring upon her hand without making either of them owe anyone anything. In the years that followed, he learned languages and griefs. He wrote to her on each birthday and burned each letter not from cowardice, but because posting them felt like asking a wound to answer the postman. He sent, anonymously, contributions to the schools she supported, stood once in the back of a chapel in Rome, and heard her name prayed by a missionary who had never seen London, and felt both blessed and punished. He became, by practice, an honest man. He did not know whether that would ever be the same as being forgiven. And so the memory stood, a chapel emptied of music, a bride who refused to make his sin her costume, a letter from a dead mother that had tried to save both his soul and his future, and had instead cost him both for a time. When London's fog pressed its cold nose to the panes of his returned residence, he could smell orange blossom again, and see, without mercy, the look in Arabella's eyes he had earned, a calm that had learned to exist without him. He had come back to discover whether a man may finish after a decade the sentence he should have spoken plainly on the morning he ran. I choose you, and I will pay whatever is owed to do it honestly. 10 years later, the day of reckoning arrived, not with thunder, but with music. The Duke's carriage drew up before the Penrith mansion, where society rehearsed its forgiveness every Thursday under chandeliers too fragile for honesty. Inside, the air smelled of champagne and calculation. The season was in full swing, and every woman had remembered to be merciful only toward herself. Edward, Duke of Ashbourne, stood a moment on the steps, his breath turning to cloud, the ring in his pocket pressing against the pulse in his thigh, like a conscience that had learned carpentry. He had written no introduction, composed no speech. Time, he had decided, would have to serve as his secretary. He entered, and London's orchestra of gossip faltered. Men whose fortunes were newer than their titles nodded cautiously. Women whose forgiveness was for hire examined him as one examines a relic to confirm authenticity. He had come as rumor first, and rumor does not easily believe in flesh. The host, the Dowager Duchess of Penrith, age a fortress disguised as lace, met him at the threshold of the ballroom with a politeness so correct it felt like penance. Your Grace, she said, you are brave to appear in company. So soon. 10 years is soon, he asked quietly. She raised one eyebrow. For some sins, she replied. Eternity would seem hasty. Then she smiled, a general acknowledging a duel, and gestured toward the throng. And there she was, Lady Arabella Whitmore, standing beside a marble pillar under a chandelier's indulgent light, her gown a sober silver that made diamonds seem noisy, her hair swept back to reveal a line of throat as elegant as an apology never spoken. Her beauty had matured into intention. She no longer performed it. Conversation swirled around her like tide around a rock. The years had touched her lightly, favoring dignity over ornament, yet the amber of her eyes had kept its fierce precision, the look of someone who has built peace plank by plank and will not sell it cheaply. He crossed the room as men do when they fear courage will evaporate if left idle. Their eyes met. Recognition arrived without sentimentality. For one suspended second, the ball continued to spin, violins, whispers, fans, but the air between them became private territory. He bowed, the gesture measured to confess without pleading. She curtsied with equal precision. "Your Grace," she said. The words contained neither warmth nor frost, only a fact. "Lady Arabella," he answered, his voice steadier than his pulse. "It has been a decade." "And a week," she said, as if to rescue the record from inaccuracy. Then, almost kindly, "You look remarkably unchanged." "Age has been less imaginative with me," he said, "and you—" "I had more to learn." Her tone was not boast, but boundary. Silence threatened. She saved them both by extending a hand toward the card tables where the dowager had installed a kind of court. "If you have returned to gamble, you will find better company there than before. The young have discovered the pleasure of losing gracefully. I came to play only one game, and its rules were written long ago," he said before he could stop himself. She turned then, fully, the lamplight writing gold in her hair. "If you mean to atone," she said softly, "you have chosen an inconvenient setting. Forgiveness is not fashionable this season." He smiled, almost boyish, and in that instant the years between them fell away like drapery burned by accident. "I never suited fashion," he said. "Then you may find we agree on something at last." A waltz began, lush and imperial. Couples moved like sentences seeking proper endings. "Will you dance?" he asked. "We have danced that one before," she said. "I stumbled," he admitted. "You disappeared," she corrected. "An improvement on clumsiness?" "Only in the eyes of cowards." The orchestra rose. She hesitated, then placed her hand lightly upon his arm. Not surrender, but experiment. "One measure," she said. They moved together with a rhythm memory supplied. The crowd observed with appetite disguised as admiration. He could feel, through the satin of her glove, the heartbeat she kept so disciplined. "I have rehearsed this moment 1,000 times," he said under the music, "and yet it feels like trespass." "Perhaps it is," she said. "A man cannot enter the past without knocking." "I have knocked," he said, "for years." "Then you must have chosen the wrong door." When the dance ended, she stepped back steady and he bowed again, not the polished bow of a duke, but the small, weary bow of a man who knows ceremony cannot save him. "May I call upon you tomorrow?" he asked. "To finish the conversation we should have had 10 years ago." She studied him, not as one appraises a suitor, but as one examines a story to see if it has learned its lesson. "Tomorrow is a word that has disappointed me before," she said. "Then let us call it today, extended." Her lips almost curved. "You always did confuse grammar with charm." "And you," he said, "always corrected me. As one must if one wishes to remain understood." The dowager approached then, the signal for civility to resume. Arabella inclined her head. "Very well, Your Grace. Call tomorrow. We will speak, though I warn you, I have grown accustomed to silence. It behaves better than most men." "I will endeavor to behave worse," he said, and the dowager, overhearing, lifted her fan to conceal a smile that was mostly nostalgia. When she turned away, the room exhaled. He stood alone among chandeliers that pretended innocence. Around him, the murmur resumed, whispers tasting the word return, fans spelling out conjecture, eyes measuring the ruin and the resurrection in equal parts. He looked once more toward the pillar where she had stood and saw only the ripple she left behind, like perfume, like memory, like consequence. Outside, night clung to the carriages. The city smelled of rain not yet decided. Ellis, waiting at the door, asked no questions. "She has agreed to see you?" the servant said finally. "Tomorrow," the Duke answered, "a word with poor reputation." He stepped into the carriage. "Still," he added half to himself, "I intend to teach it to mean something." Arabella received him at noon, because noon does not pretend to romance. It is the hour at which truth can be seen without flattering light, and the drawing-room she chose, small, high-windowed, furnished as if thrift had taught elegance to mind its manners, offered neither intimacy nor spectacle, only chairs that required the spine to tell the truth. The dowager had gone out, or arranged to be seen going out. Ellis, admitted by the front step with the courtesy due to men who look after other men's regrets, vanished like a footnote. Arabella stood by the mantel as a judge might stand before a rail no one else could see. She did not bid him sit, and so he remained standing until she, moved by either mercy or economy, inclined toward the chair opposite and took it herself. "Speak." Your Grace, she said, not unkindly, but with the composure of a woman who has learned that tears are a currency she will not spend in public. Begin where the truth begins and not where you hope it ends. He did not clear his throat. He did not reach for brandy. He did not rehearse. I left you, he said, because the jewels on your neck were stolen from widows I never met. My father bought them with money that was not his, was not ours, and my mother contrived to warn me on the morning of our wedding. She asked a fortnight to make it right. I told myself I would spare you the shame of a ceremony postponed by theft. I told myself I would return having already paid what was owed. I told myself cowardice was duty, and so I ran. He stopped, and the clock on the mantel surrendered 3 indifferent ticks. She did not blink at the word stolen. She had suspected something like it, or something worse, and suspicion breeds a stoic kind of immunity. Why did you not tell me? She asked, and though he had expected the question, its simplicity unseated him. Because I thought the truth, spoken then, would make you carry it, he said. Because I believed the city would call it your scandal, not mine. Because my pride, raw, naive, imagined I could return as a savior rather than arrive as a sinner and ask you to stand beside me while I confessed. His hands were open, empty. The ring in his pocket felt, absurdly, like a stone he deserved to drown beneath. I'm not asking you to call that love, he added after a moment. I'm telling you what I mistook for it. Arabella looked past him, not to avoid his face, but to find the exact word and pay it in full. You chose secrecy, she said at last, over partnership. You chose my reputation over my consent. You chose to protect me from humiliation and delivered me to abandonment. The sentence did not accuse, it categorized. You are not the first man, she went on, gentler, to confound control with care. She rose then, and crossed to the window where London performed its ordinary heroism. Porters bent to their burdens, a flower seller insisting upon color in weather that had no opinion of it. I stood in the chapel, Edward, she said, using his name as if returning a book she had finished. I stood before our friends and our enemies, and the people who cannot tell the difference. And when they turned to look for you, I found that I had a spine. I discovered that it holds better when it is not being leaned upon by a promise. I went home. I ate soup. I slept. And the next day I woke to discover that I had not died of other people's sentences. She turned back. That is the truth I began with. He took the blow gratefully. The only men who despise accuracy are those still hiding. I deserved every day of it, he said, every column, every silence. I deserved your mother's refusal to see me and your father's courtesy like a closed fist. And your letters, when they came at all, folded with a precision that made forgiveness look like surgery. A breath. But I did not waste it. I spent it buying mercy in cities that do not speak of it and returning what my father took. I sold portraits of men I no longer wished to resemble. I learned to be punctual with atonement. He let his gaze lower, not in defeat, but in discipline. I do not bring this as a defense. I bring it as a receipt. Receipts are for shopkeepers, she said, and the faintest light of humor, or Mercy's cousin, touched the corner of her mouth. What you owe cannot be itemized. She motioned to the chair now, and he obeyed, grateful for any instruction that kept him within reach of worthiness. Tell me this, she said, settling opposite, hands quiet in her lap. In all the years you were repairing other people's losses, did you consider that you had turned me into a charity you could not face? Yes, he said, and the word startled them both by its speed. I wrote to you every birthday and burned each letter because asking the post to carry my shame felt like conscripting a stranger into my war. I gave to your schools anonymously and learned that generosity without a name cannot hope for applause and therefore is safe. I stood in churches and asked for the courage to stop auditioning for absolution. I do not expect any of that to interest you. I expect only this to count. I am here. He placed upon the table the small leather pouch that held the ring, unfastened it, and let the circle breathe. The emeralds had learned in a decade to be modest. It was sized for a bride I failed, he said. I have not altered it. If it fits now, it will do so because neither of us has the heart we had that day, and perhaps that is the only fit that matters. She did not touch it. Instead, she asked softly, "When you think of me, do you think of the woman who waited in a chapel or the one who learned to go home and eat soup?" He closed his eyes, briefly, because truth dislikes theatrics, and answered, "Both. The first is the vow I broke. The second is the strength I must never presume to own." When he opened them, she was looking at him with something like weather about to change. "I believed once," she said, "that love would spare me the necessity of being brave. Then I learned that it was the reason to be brave. Do you understand that now?" "I do," he said, "and I understand this as well, that love without consent is tyranny, and consent without truth is theater." Silence then. Good silence, the kind that does not punish. The clock contributed another neat assembly of ticks. A hansom rattled past, a child laughed, a dog misunderstood an order with pleasure. Arabella rose, crossed to a small writing desk, and opened a drawer. From it she drew a folded sheet, thin, crackling, a decade old. "Your letter," she said. "The first one. I did not answer, because I do not answer emergencies with novels." She placed it beside the ring. "Today you have done what you could have done then. You have said the words before asking me to wear them. That is an improvement." She closed the drawer as if to discourage further archaeology and returned to her chair. "What do you want of me, Edward? Say it plainly, without chivalry. Chivalry muddies water best when it's already clear." "I want," he said, and the word sounded younger than he had been in years, "the chance to court the woman I abandoned, not to erase the abandonment, but to build upon the fact that it occurred and that I am still here. I want to ask you to let me stand where weather is worst. I want to be useful." He almost smiled. "I want to be punctual for once in a matter of the heart." He did not reach for the ring. "If your answer is no, I will accept it with the gratitude owed to a verdict that saves a man from perjury." She studied him, his face reordered by apology, his hands ungloved like a citizen's, the way he stayed in the chair rather than dropped to his knees and asked the carpet to do his theater for him. Then she said, "I will not be courted as recompense. I will not be married as evidence, but I will permit conversation. I will permit presence. I will permit you to carry the groceries of my causes and the tedium of my Tuesdays. If you return next week at noon, we will go to St. Agnes's school together and shelve books that prefer low hands. You may begin there." He stood, not too quickly, because haste is a cousin to panic, and bowed as one bows to a future that has unbolted its door. "Next week," he said, "at noon." "Do not be late," she answered, and the smile that failed to become one fully was better than triumph. He gathered the ring, not to hide it, but to keep it from staring, and placed it back into its pouch. At the door, he paused. "Arabella," he said carefully, "if at any hour the weight of my presence resembles the weight of my absence, say so, and I will remove it." "That," she replied, "is the first promise you have made that I believe you will keep." He left into a London afternoon the color of pewter polished by honest hands. The street felt narrower, which is how hope often begins, like good posture. Behind him in the quiet room, a woman who had not died of other people's sentences permitted herself the smallest exhale. On the table, a ring waited, less a demand now than a hypothesis, and in the space between them, no longer a decade, but a week, the city arranged the ordinary mercies that permit extraordinary repairs: a book to be shelved, a noon to be kept, a grammar lesson in which we might learn, with practice, to be a true pronoun again. He arrived at noon with the politeness of rain that is learned where roofs are. Arabella noticed not the carriage, uncrested again, a vow against spectacle, but the fact that he was early and waited at the corner until the church clock made his punctuality legal. When he crossed the square to St. Agnes's school, he did so carrying a crate of primers, as if contrition had muscles and had been training for this exact errand. The school itself was humble. Brick warmed by a stubborn sun, windows that looked as if they had decided to be clean without being asked, a yard where jump rope chants auditioned for immortality. But inside lived a republic Arabella had helped found. Shelves of books at children's eye level, a small cabinet labeled Repair, where glue and thread outnumbered shames, a chalkboard that remembered the names of girls who had, at last, learned to see their own handwriting as citizenship. The headmistress, Mrs. Godfrey, broad-shouldered, bright-eyed as laundry on a line, met them with the frankness of women who manage miracles on budgets. "My lord," she said, refusing the more expensive courtesy, "your hands appear idle." "Not for long," he answered, and let her direct him to the crates marked Geography, Escape, and Numbers, Comfort, labels that Arabella, startled, recognized as her own private catechism copied into the world. They worked without ceremony. He lifted, she sorted, he hammered a bracket without swearing. She taught a girl to shelve by author rather than by color, because color, beloved as it is, sometimes lies about kinship. Children watched with the investigative silence peculiar to those who have seen adults pretend at kindness and are eager to confirm the presence of the real article. One brave creature with a ribbon that had recently survived a fight asked, "Are you a duke?" "I'm a man learning the alphabet again," he said. "What letter are you on?" She considered. Apology, she decided, and returned to chalk with the satisfied air of a clerk who has balanced an account. Arabella bit back a smile that would have made the room overconfident. At midday, Mrs. Godfrey produced tea as if conjured. The cups were chipped, and so was the conversation, but both held. "We have had," she said matter-of-factly, "a debt from the Widows' Fund in Vienna. Long story, foreign currencies are rude. And this morning, as if angels could be taught to do arithmetic, a bank draft arrived that speaks our language." Arabella's gaze flicked, then steadied. The Duke did not look at her. "Foreign currencies," he murmured, "become less rude when you speak to them in their own grammar." Mrs. Godfrey, who had no patience for the choreography of pride, put a hand the size of a map upon his shoulder. "I do not know what you did, sir, but I recognize the posture of a man who has carried a sack of stones to a place less crowded. St. Agnes's is grateful." He bowed his head, not the titled bow of a court, but the practical inclination of a laborer acknowledging lunch. After tea, he repaired a wobbly desk with the stubborn tenderness of a surgeon who prefers wood. He scraped his knuckle and swore, softly, in Latin. "An improvement," Arabella said, handing him a cloth. "Your profanity now educates." "It was always my best subject," he replied, and the girls at the nearest table learned, delighted, that grown men bleed and then pretend they meant to. When school let out, he swept the yard with a borrowed broom because the wind had voted to be democratic with papers. 2 boys, anxious to apprentice themselves to usefulness, joined. By the time the yard remembered itself, the Duke of Ashbourne was an unremarkable geometry of sleeves and dust, and Arabella, watching from the doorway, thought, "Humility is a color that suits him better than velvet ever did." Walking back through the square, he kept to her pace, which was the pace of women who have more appointments than hours and choose both. "Tomorrow," he said, "there's a meeting at the Naval Widows' Home. I have asked to speak, not to be applauded, but to be specific." "Specificity," she replied, "is apology's only accent." She did not ask to attend. She went. The hall smelled of starch and seawater, and a decade of grief folded neatly. Women sat with the quiet that follows storms long enough to breed furniture. A secretary read names as if stitching, a collection tin passed like communion. When called, the Duke stood without the defensive choreography of a gentleman and said simply, "I am Edward, Duke of Ashbourne. My father's accounts, in their errors, touched your accounts. I am here to say what was owed is paid, what is disputed is being tried, and what cannot be repaired will be remembered, until remembering is the only honest currency left." A murmur ran the room's perimeter. He did not embellish. He produced ledgers, receipts as dull as bread, and placed them on the table where any widow could open them. One did, and nodded, and that nod did more to launder a name than 1,000 headlines could. When a reporter rose afterward with a smile like a sharpened spoon and asked if the Duke wished to shape the narrative, Edward answered, "Stories behave best when they are true." The paper printed a small column the next day, disorientingly free of gossip, as if London had briefly agreed to be adult. In the days that followed, Arabella permitted him errands that looked like friendship from far away and like work up close. He fetched crates, drafted correspondence for charities whose patronage would benefit from a signature not his own, and learned to accept being ignored by committees until the moment a table needed carrying. He did not dazzle. He did not audition. He did not require the weather to notice him. When he failed, arriving with the wrong size of paper, miscounting the hymnals, he corrected himself without theatrics and apologized without furnishing his apology with cushions. Children grew certain that he would appear on Thursdays with apples in Latin that forgave irregularity. Women who had no time for romance conceded that he kept time better than most clocks. Arabella watched the quiet architecture of his contrition rise without scaffolding. Once at dusk, she found him in the schoolyard, jacket off, sleeves rolled, rehanging a crooked sign that read, "Reading Room." The nail resisted. He coaxed, failed, then laughed, a sound she remembered from a life where laughter had been a daily bread, and tried again. "Some walls," he said without turning, "have learned to distrust nails." "They prefer ribbon," she said. "It does less harm and holds more faithfully." He hammered once more. The sign settled into levelness with the satisfied sigh of things finally persuaded. He stepped back, and in the warm, undecided light, his profile looked less like a portrait and more like a belonging. The test arrived because tests do, uninvited and dressed as ordinary trouble. A benefactor, young, fashionable, and comfortable in the currency of gossip, offered St. Agnes's a handsome donation with the condition that her name adorn a marble plaque far larger than the one dedicated to the first headmistress. Mrs. Godfrey, tempted. The trustees, divided. Arabella, cautious. The Duke listened, then requested 5 minutes with the donor. "I am freshly acquainted with the vanity of inscriptions," he said, and led the woman to the reading room where shelves, stubbornly at child height, did their quiet work. "If your plaque is larger than Mrs. Evans's," he said, "the girls will learn that generosity is a contest and that history belongs to the last purse opened. But if you will endow the repair cabinet, renew it every year, no plaque at all, I will personally ensure that every girl knows your name because her book closed without losing its spine." The woman, who had not intended to be wise, was flattered into wisdom. She nodded, near tears, and the crisis dissolved into usefulness. Arabella, who had remained in the hall, trusting him to prefer dignity over victory, felt something shift in her carefully defended chest, not surrender, not yet, but the awareness that relief is a species of love's advance guard. On Sunday, he sat with her and the dowager at Penrith's pew, endured an anthem longer than penance, and left without trying to make the sermon about him. On Monday, he walked with her in the park and did not steer her toward solitude as if privacy were a trap. Instead, he matched his stride to hers and admired dogs. On Tuesday, he arrived late, by 3 minutes, and did not fashion tragedy from it. He said, "Forgive me," once, and corrected the habit by being early thereafter. On Wednesday, he brought the ring to St. Agnes's, not to present, but to hold while he shelved, a reminder that hands meant to carry promises should learn first to carry books. By Thursday, Mrs. Godfrey observed to no one in particular that certain men, like certain shelves, require only the right bracket to be trusted. And yet, as the week turned, Arabella felt the old geography under her feet, chasms mapped, bridges unbuilt. At night, in the quiet that keeps no secrets from women, she stood at her window and considered the two truths he had forced into the same room, that he had abandoned her before a crowd and that he was now building furniture the crowd would never see. Which weighed more? Which taught better? She could not yet answer, but when she turned from the glass, she found on her desk a note delivered by Ellis with the discretion of a sacrament. "Tomorrow at noon, if you can bear a walk to the river, I will tell you the last of it. Not the part papers would buy, but the part only you have the right to own. E." She closed her eyes and felt the letter's modest heat, the way one feels a hearth in a house that has done the work to deserve one. She slept badly and well, badly because old wounds itch when weather changes, well because usefulness had tired her into honesty. In the morning she dressed without adornment and told the dowager she would be out. "With the Duke?" the older woman asked not unkindly. "With a man who is trying to be one," Arabella said. The dowager smiled the way veterans do when a young soldier volunteers for the front they remember. "Very good," she said. "Bring me back a report on the condition of the river. I prefer it when the Thames behaves." The river did what rivers do. It practiced remembering without repetition. The Thames wore its silt like history and its wind like advice. Arabella and the Duke walked side by side upon its embankment, where London's afternoon light performed its usual trick of forgiving everything in sepia. He carried no cane. She carried no fan. They were stripped to conversation and the long breath of the tide. For the first quarter mile, they said nothing. It was not an awkward silence. It was the silence of a forge waiting to be used. He broke it first. "You have seen what I have made of the ruins," he said, "but you have not yet heard what the ruins made of me." "I am listening," she said, her eyes on the water where the reflection of Westminster drifted like memory that refuses to drown. He told her about Naples, the family that bore his father's name but none of his protection, the children he had found there, taught to read with his own fortune, about Paris, where creditors had threatened to auction not only property, but the correspondence that would have humiliated every woman his father had flattered, about the duel fought on a gray morning in Vienna against a colonel who believed the Duke had inherited his father's dishonor. "He was right," Edward said. "I stood at dawn and I thought, if I fall, my blood will at least stop arguing with his shadow. But I did not fall. The bullet took my jaw, and I learned how to speak without lying." Arabella listened unmoving. "And your mother's letter?" she asked. "I still cannot decide whether she was your accomplice or your conscience." He looked up, toward the sky, where gulls drew sentences no man could edit. "Both," he said. "She loved me enough to try to save me, and she distrusted me enough to make it hard. Her letter reached me because she knew guilt travels faster than mail." They walked farther, to a place where the smell of the city softened. He gestured to a bench half hidden by willows, and she sat. "You want me to pity you?" she said after a moment. "I cannot." "No," he answered. "I would despise myself if you did. I want you to know that I learned the language you spoke that morning in the chapel, the language of standing alone and not turning it into tragedy. It is a language difficult for men born to command. It uses smaller words but stronger verbs. I am fluent now." She looked at him then, properly. The decade had written lines near his eyes, but they were of labor, not dissipation. "You have done good," she said, "but good is not the same as changed." He smiled, rueful. "No, change is not what one does, it is what one lets die. I have let pride die, and some vanity, and a great deal of certainty. What remains is only will. Will is quieter." "Then why bring the ring?" she asked suddenly, the question cutting air. He reached into his coat and produced it, not with flourish, but with a reverence learned from handling relics. "Because I promised myself that it would not end as an heirloom of regret," he said. "It is not to beg or to barter. It is to finish the sentence we began." She did not take it. Her gaze went beyond him, to the children skipping stones, to the ripple that swallowed their laughter. "If I take it," she said, "I return to a day the world enjoyed too much. I do not live there." "I know," he said. "That day belongs to rumor. I would rather build a new one, even if it never reaches the altar, even if it is only a life of Tuesdays and errands. You have the courage for the ordinary. I wish to earn that." Something changed in her then, a breath drawn differently, an old knot remembering it could be undone. "You speak as though love were apprenticeship," she said. "It is," he replied, "and I am still the clumsy apprentice." They watched the water. The sky began to silver, and the gulls' cries blurred with carriage wheels beyond the bridge. "You said you would tell me the last of it," she reminded him. He nodded. "The last of it is small, but not simple. The card I left you on that morning, 3 words. Forgive me. Wait. It never reached you. It was set aside with the ribbons. I learned this only 2 years ago from Ellis, who confessed, because age had made truth fashionable. The card still exists. It is in my pocket now." He drew it out, yellowed and thin, the handwriting faded but legible. "I kept it, not as an excuse, but as evidence that my first intention was better than my act." Arabella took it, read it, and for the first time her hand trembled. "So," she whispered, "there was a message." "Yes," he said, "and still I should have been there." She looked down, the card between her fingers, and the water below mirrored her stillness. "Do you know," she said slowly, "how long it takes for a woman to stop inventing the letter she wishes she had received?" "I do now," he said, voice low. Her eyes met his again, sharp and wet. 10 years, Edward. 10 years I told myself you had written one more line, that you had said I will come back, and that perhaps I had not read far enough. I made your absence grammatical. I conjugated grief until it behaved. She laughed then, a sound without mockery, only fatigue. And now here it is. 3 words. It was almost kinder to have none. I thought so once, he said. Now I see that kindness and cruelty both dress in the same silence. The wind stirred. The card fluttered. She caught it and folded it carefully. I shall keep it, she said, as proof that stories do have beginnings, even if they wander. He watched her, wanting to speak but knowing the moment was not his to decorate. She rose. I cannot promise what you want, she said. My forgiveness has already been granted to the woman I became, not the man who asks. But if you mean to continue being useful to others and not to guilt, I will not stand in your way. He stood too. Then I will remain useful until usefulness becomes love's twin. Do not make poetry of it, she said, smiling despite herself. The river already does that. They walked back in companionable silence, the distance between them shrinking not by inches but by intention. When they reached the carriage road, she paused. Next Thursday, she said, the school will need new paint. If you can still swing a brush, come. He bowed deeply, without the pretense of ceremony. I will be there, on time. As she turned away, the wind off the river caught her shawl. He reached instinctively to steady it, and for a brief second their hands met, warm, unarmored. She did not withdraw immediately. Instead, she let the touch linger just long enough to prove that ghosts can indeed be solid if both people will it. When she walked on, he looked down at his hand as though relearning its purpose. The card fluttered once more in the breeze. He caught it, smiled, and tucked it back into his pocket beside the ring. Both relics, both promises waiting for the right grammar of time. Calamity, when it wishes to examine the truth of people, puts on the plainest clothes. It arrived at St. Agnes's as a smell before it was a sight, the bitter metallic breath of smoke slipping through keyholes and along the eaves as evening prepared its lamps, and within minutes the square outside the school became a theater where London rehearsed its oldest lesson. That fire is the only gossip worth believing. Arabella, on her way back from the widow's hall, with accounts balanced and patience not, saw the first orange flutter against the far warehouse roof and quickened her steps. Children had been dismissed hours before. Mrs. Godfrey had turned keys, but Flame respects neither schedules nor locks. A cry went up. Buckets appeared as if the cobbles kept them under oath. A chain of hands arranged itself from the pump to the blaze. Ellis, who could be relied upon to materialize where necessity did, was already shouting in the measured tones that make panic feel uninvited. The wind is wrong, he said, glancing at the soot-drawn flag of direction above the alley. If the roof catches, the reading room will go. The Duke of Ashbourne arrived without trumpets, coat off, sleeves shoved, hair already salted with soot. He did not look at Arabella first. He looked at the doors, at the windows, at the small triangle of roof that shaded the repair cabinet he had argued into immortality 2 weeks before. "Children?" he asked. "Home," Mrs. Godfrey panted, "but the books, the ledgers, the maps, the things can be remade," he said, and then, after a heartbeat in which he counted consequences, "and promises must not burn." He shouldered past 2 men who had the good sense to let a purpose taller than theirs pass, found the side passage that stubborn doors prefer, and vanished into the smoke with a soaked cloth over his mouth and the unadorned confidence of someone who has already died once to something and isn't frightened of rehearsal. Arabella's body took its vote before her mind could cheat. She seized the nearest bucket and joined the line. Water passed hand to hand in the old sacrament of cities that have no patience for explanations. The fire, pleased to have attention, threw itself high. Sparks, ambitious, leapt toward the school's modest roof. "Ladder," Ellis called. The Duke had not reappeared. Arabella felt the old familiarity of helplessness, rage to be misread as fear. "No one else goes in," a constable barked, sensible and late. "Then bring 'em out," she answered, sensible and furious. The crowd, which recognizes when a sentence outranks a uniform, pressed harder with the buckets. When Edward emerged at last, he did so, carrying the cabinet of continuances like a priest returning with a relic. His shirt was singed. A cut along his forearm bled with the honesty of Wood's revenge. In his other hand, ridiculous wholly, swung the small sign that read, "Reading Room." He coughed out smoke as if evicting a tenant. "Shelves," he croaked, thrusting the cabinet toward Ellis, who seized it as if catching a child. "And the ledgers," he added, producing from his coat the limp, damp bundle whose figures represented food disguised as numbers. He looked at Arabella then finally, through eyes made wet by smoke and not apology this time, and she saw no performance, only fact. The warehouse roof surrendered with a groan like a tired oath. Flame licked higher, then sideways. A gust bullied cinders into a small meteor shower over the schoolyard, but the soaked blankets Mrs. Godfrey had commanded and the bucket line Ellis conducted performed their plain heroics. Singe, smudge, scorch. Yes, but burn. Not tonight. When the worst had been exhausted and the fire consented to become merely stubborn, the crowd did what crowds do when disappointed of tragedy. It began to go home. The constable, chastened by usefulness he had not arranged, muttered commendations. Mrs. Godfrey sat down on a wet step and cried exactly 3 tears before remembering she had a school to open tomorrow, and Arabella, shaking because motion must go somewhere, turned toward the Duke and saw that his hands, those newly educated hands, were trembling as if nails had finally asked for their fee. "Come," she said, and did not wait for pride to ask permission. She took him by the wrist and led him into the reading room, which smelled of steam and scrip and victory withheld from ashes. There, under the slightly crooked sign he had rescued as if words depend on wood, she bound his arm with linen ripped from the bottom of a curtain that consented to become useful. She wiped soot from his face with the ruthless tenderness a midwife uses when slapping breath into a stubborn newborn. "You fool," she said, and because the word is, in certain grammars, indistinguishable from love, it did not insult. "What if you had not come out?" "Then the cabinet would have," he said, grimacing as the alcohol did its moral work. "I promised the girls repair on Thursdays. Promises must not burn." "Nor Duke's," she said, softer. "You cannot rebuild a city with corpses." He looked at her, and the smile he found felt earned. "No," he said. "One rebuilds it with women who know when to rip a curtain." A messenger found them before the room had finished remembering itself as a library. He bore a letter sealed with the discreet lion of a banker too dignified to roar. "For His Grace," he announced, as if titles prevent heatstroke. Edward broke the seal. His eyes moved like a man mapping cliffs by touch. "Say it aloud," Arabella said. He obeyed. "Ashbourne, regret to inform, warehouse owner has rescinded offer to sell adjoining property to St. Agnes's." He looked up, unsurprised. Catastrophe often travels in pairs. "There was accepted a higher bid from Mr. Cray, who intends to convert the structure to a gaming hall. Contract to be signed at noon tomorrow. Respectfully, Baines." Mrs. Godfrey made the sign of the cross in an alphabet practical women reserve for calamities. A gaming hall next door to a school would be noise, spectacle, ruin disguised as merriment. Arabella's face did not change. It settled, the way iron does when it remembers being ore. "Then we shall outbid," she said. "We shall not," Mrs. Godfrey replied gently. "We have pennies sorted into tins. We do not have noon." Edward, who had blood drying into the cuff of a borrowed shirt, spoke as one who is accustomed to writing figures over pain. "I do," he said. "Or rather, I have the line of credit that functions as tomorrow for people who do not deserve it." Arabella's eyes narrowed. "At what cost?" "At the cost of naming a collateral," he answered simply. "Ashbourne House and the Derbyshire estate." Ellis inhaled, a sound like a ledger rediscovering subtraction. "Your Grace," he began, and stopped. Facts had outrun etiquette. Edward turned to Arabella, not seeking permission, seeking witness. "Gaming halls do not build cabinets of continuance," he said, "nor do they forgive irregular verbs. St. Agnes's is a better bet than my pride." "You must not lose your home for us," Mrs. Godfrey protested, rising with the dignity that refuses to be improved upon by charity. He shook his head. "A house is a noun. A school is a verb. We have too many nouns." Arabella felt something inside her, some last strand of guardedness plucked across years, thrill to that grammar. You will be ruined if the market turns, she said, testing the sentence as one tests a rope. Then I shall have to learn to be useful without a crest, he replied. I am being well trained. He turned to Ellis. Have Baines meet Cray at his office at 11:30. Prepare documents that shame him into discretion, and send for my solicitor with the Derbyshire deed. Ellis, who had loved him through a decade of absence and was prepared to love him through penury if the penury behaved, nodded once and departed at the trot of a man who has watched young masters become men in rooms with less smoke. The night, having exhausted its drama, finally remembered how to be dark. Arabella and Edward stood a while with Mrs. Godfrey in the doorway of the school, looking at the sullen, wet warehouse and the modest rectangle of brick it had tried and failed to terrify. Tomorrow, Arabella said, I will bring the trustees. Tomorrow, he answered, I will bring the bank. They did not touch. Soot makes romantics of the impractical, but their nearness reorganized the air. He arrived at Baines's office earlier than he had arrived at anything in his life, except regret. Cray, red-cheeked and satisfied, was already there, papers arranged before him like bait. Your Grace, the financier purred, as if he had been practicing the title all morning. Have you considered the disadvantages of sentiment? I have learned its mathematics, Edward said. Consider the advantages of reputation. He placed upon the table 2 documents. 1, a bid that exceeded Cray's by a sum plucked from the architecture of his future. 2, a letter addressed to 3 newspapers, written in impeccable boredom, detailing the philanthropic advisability of preventing a gaming hall beside a school for girls. If I lose the building, I send the letter, he said mildly. If I win it, the letter stays, unsent, and your heirs may gamble in more appropriate proximity to other people's unhappiness. Cray blustered, then calculated, then, being a man whose loyalty had always belonged to profit, sighed and signed. Baines added his own signature with the relief of a man who has avoided being summarized in print by his enemies. By noon, the deed was done. By 2, the trustees had consented to let the building become a hall for trades and a winter soup kitchen. By 4, Mrs. Godfrey had installed a bell that would ring only for soup and never for shame. At dusk, the Duke, arm in a better bandage, returned to St. Agnes's with a modest announcement and no plaque design. Arabella, hearing it, felt her reserve finally admit what her sense had been negotiating for days. The change had completed itself not in speeches, but in risks taken publicly for the sake of private goods. She stood with him in the yard where the soot had left shy fingerprints upon the bricks and said quietly, You have gambled for once and taught the wager to be honorable. I have only paid interest on a decade, he said. The principal remains. She looked at him, the set of his shoulders, which had learned to carry weight without advertising it, the tired brightness in his eyes, which had learned to substitute service for spectacle, and decided that the arithmetic of her heart had found at last a number it could defend. Then hear me, she said, and pleasure flinched, afraid. I have forgiven you for a long time. I waited to respect you again. Today I do. The sentence did not kiss him. It knighted him. He bowed, not low, not theatrical, only as much as a man bows when he is being given back his name. Arabella, he said, and the dusk made the word appear warmer than it is on paper. Will you? Not here, she answered, because classrooms should not be asked to host romance. Tomorrow, noon, my drawing room. Bring what you have carried for 10 years. She meant the ring, she meant the sentence. He nodded, unable for once to improve on monosyllables, and the city, satisfied with its day's work, folded its lamps and let the cool move in like forgiveness that has ceased to require advertisement. Noon arrived with the exactness of a verdict. Sunlight squared itself upon the carpet of Arabella's drawing room, as if the day had studied geometry in order to pronounce sentence, and the room, the same small, high-windowed sanctuary that had first received his confession, held itself like a witness determined not to be swayed by rhetoric. She had arranged nothing theatrical, a vase of jonquils that smelled faintly of clean promises, 2 chairs facing not each other but the same window, because love must learn the habit of looking outward, a table that had once been scorched by an incautious candle and therefore knew how to forgive heat. He entered without flourish, the uncrested carriage dismissed, Ellis a shadow at the door who withdrew the instant duty allowed. Edward was simply Edward, jacket brushed but not new, the bandage at his forearm now a neat white sermon, and in his pocket the ring that had learned patience. He bowed, brief, human, and when he lifted his head, she saw the thing she had waited a decade to see. No plea, no posture, only presence. "Thank you for coming on time," she said, and the corner of his mouth acknowledged the history compacted into the courtesy. "I have taught my clocks to fear you," he answered. "Sit," she said gently, and they took the two chairs that faced the window, a pair of children about to repeat a lesson they had finally chosen for themselves. For a moment the ordinary noises of the street, carriage wheels, a hawker's cry, the conversational argument of sparrows, filled the gap where once his promises had burned too brightly. Then she spoke, not with solemnity, but with the economy of a woman who understands that vows are tools, not trophies. "Edward," she began, "I have measured what I can bear and what I will not. I can bear a world that remembers our scandal. I cannot bear a house that forgets my work. I can bear your name, mended and still showing its seams. I cannot bear my consent being treated as decoration. If you ask me today, you must allow me to answer with conditions strong enough to keep us both honest." He turned slightly, not to protest, but to make more room for the words. "Say them," he said. "I have trained for rules." "First," she said, and the jonquils seemed to nod, "we will marry quietly, in the same chapel that once survived our absence, with the same pews and the same bell. We will invite few and owe fewer. Second, the school will not be a charity we visit, but a room in our house, figuratively and literally. A wing at Ashbourne shall be fitted with shelves at a child's height, and once a week the reading room will travel to a place that used to apologize for its silence. Third, we will keep Thursdays. Not for society, let them invent other days, but for repair, for soup, for remembering the grammar of small good things. Fourth, I will keep my work and my purse. Your fortune is a river with many tributaries, mine a well that costs effort. Both are water, both necessary, neither to be swallowed by the other. Fifth, when we disagree, and we will, you will not outvote me with your title. We shall become a parliament of two, which is the hardest kind and the only worth convening." He did not speak at once, because assent given too swiftly can look like performance. He set his hands upon his knees as though accepting a weight that fit. "Agreed," he said, and the word did not tremble. "All of it. And a sixth, if you will allow me to add to your constitution. If ever my name becomes a shadow across your work, you will tell me before the shadow lengthens, and I will move." She considered, then lifted one shoulder. The smallest curtsy mercy pays to wisdom. "Accepted." He reached into his pocket then, not like a man brandishing proof, but like one retrieving a relic from a chapel he does not presume to own. The ring, released from its pouch, found the noon with a modest flash. The emerald did not brag, the gold did not preen. They understood at last that their office was not to dazzle, but to witness. He did not kneel. The carpet had already performed too much theater for one decade. Instead, he turned his chair until they faced each other fully and laid the ring upon his open palm. "Arabella Whitmore," he said, saying the name as one reads an oath. 10 years ago, I asked you to wear this without having earned the right. I do not ask to erase that morning. I ask to crown it with a better one. Will you marry me, quietly, stubbornly, usefully, and allow me to be punctual for the rest of my life?" She did not answer at once. She looked at the ring as if confirming that metal can learn humility, then at his face to confirm the same of men. Her eyes, still amber, still exact, softened not into sentiment but into verdict. "Yes," she said, "a simple word, a hard-won continent. On the terms we have spoken and the ones we have not yet had to invent, and not because the city demands its tidy ending, but because I do. I choose you, not the boy who fled, the man who stayed." He exhaled, not as men do when reprieved, but as those who have been given a task suited to their hands. He took the ring carefully, reached for her left hand, and paused, a new ritual born on the instant. "With your consent?" he asked, because consent, repeated, trains love to keep its manners. "With my consent," she said, and offered her hand. The ring slid, no drama, no resistance, home. It fit, not because her finger had been designed for it, but because time, That best of jewelers had sized them both to the right life. Neither of them wept, neither needed to. Instead, they sat with the quiet that follows a good decision and let Noon approve. "Shall we tell the Dowager?" he asked, almost shy, and she smiled in that sideways way he had once mistaken for reserve and now recognized as strength drafted into humor. "Let the bell tell her," she said. "We will ring it ourselves." And so they did, walking the few streets to St. Martin's with no entourage but Ellis, who trailed at a distance out of respect for scenes he had not earned, entering the familiar chapel where a verger recognized them and had the good sense to become temporarily blind, climbing to the small wooden rope and pulling together until the old bell, once the herald of their failure, threw its voice across roofs and markets and the unsuspecting air. The sound was not triumphant, it was thorough. Afterward, in the vestry where years ago a note had gone missing, they stood a moment before the little table and the tidy chaos of ribbons. Edward took from his pocket the yellowed card. "Forgive me. Wait," and laid it beside a clean sheet. He wrote, deliberately, as if signing a deed. "Thank you." "Yes." She read, nodded, and placed the old beneath the new, a palimpsest of beginning and answer. Then she handed both to the verger with the instruction, "Bind these into the parish book, not for gossip but for accuracy." The man bowed, happy to be custodian of sentences that had finally learned their order. The wedding, 2 weeks later, for a fortnight, is sometimes a promise kept late, was as she had ordered it. Small, noon-lit with jonquils, with Mrs. Godfrey reading a lesson about mustard seeds and repair, with the trustees in clean coats and the girls of St. Agnes's admitted to the gallery on the condition that they refrain from correcting the homily's Latin. The Dowager cried exactly as much as taste permits, and then a little more. Ellis wept like a veteran seeing peace break out. No newspaper printed a caricature because there was no caricature to draw. Goodness, when properly dressed, is hard to satirize. After the vows, they were brief, commas more than trumpets, the couple walked, not to a carriage groaning with ribbons, but down the lane to the school, where the girls had prepared a banner in letters as uneven as courage. "We remember together." The reading room's traveling wing had already been installed at Ashbourne's townhouse, shelves set low as promised, the repair cabinet given a place of honor that embarrassed it. That evening, instead of a ball, they hosted soup, ladles and laughter, and nobles elbow to elbow with laundresses, and the Duke at the door shaking hands as if receiving ambassadors, which, in a republic of need, he was. Months followed that refused to be spectacular, and therefore were happy. Thursdays kept their covenant, the gaming hall became a trades hall, the soup bell invented a season that made winters shorter. At Ashbourne House, one of the grand salons learned to accept boots and chalk dust. Another learned that music played for children is a better inheritance than portraits of ancestors who never earned their frames. They quarreled twice, once about a speech he wished to give and she wished him not to, once about a donation she wished to make and he feared would overtax her purse, and both times he remembered to ask permission for his insistence. Both times she remembered that mercy is not a synonym for surrender. Both times the Parliament of Two reached a vote without injuries. On the first anniversary of the fire, they stood again in the schoolyard with Mrs. Godfrey and Ellis and a handful of girls now tall enough to pass down books without standing on stools. Arabella placed her hand upon the slightly crooked reading room sign and left it there as one leaves a benediction. Edward, that old apprentice of love, presented a small brass plate, not for the school's wall, but for the back of the rescued cabinet, hidden, private, the way gratitude should be. It read, "Promises must not burn." That night, when London lay quiet as a page, after the last line, he found her at the window and stood beside her in the posture they had practiced, not facing each other, but together, facing the world. "Does it seem," he asked softly, "that we have finished the sentence?" She leaned her shoulder into his, the most eloquent punctuation. "We have learned the grammar," she said. "Sentences make themselves when the parts agree." He turned then, not for spectacle, but for inventory, and counted what the years had refused to take. Her steady gaze, the clean amber of it, the hand that wore his ring with the casual certainty of a tool in use. "Arabella," he murmured, not as a prayer, not as an apology, but as a name that had at last found the correct address. She did not answer in words. She reached for the lamp, lowered its flame to a warm, working glow, and led him from the window toward a room where Noon and Night had agreed to meet, usefully, quietly, stubbornly, like the rest of their days.